All right, as we saw in the previous video, it looks like what we mean by food, if we're thinking of food in terms of a socially constructed category, it looks like then food might be super subjective in some regard. So that's the question we're going to turn to now. In what sense, if any at all, should we think that food is subjective? So remember that according to the social construction notion of food, that meant that food was determined by what we have to say about it, what we believe about it, right? If society says X is food, then that's what food is. So if we define food purely in terms of this kind of social notion, the social construction, similar to what we might say about something like money or borders or gender, we might ask, does that make it less real? Right? The fact that borders would exist only insofar as human beings exist, such that if human beings all disappeared, then so would the borders. Would the same thing happen to apply with regard to food? If all of the human beings and all of the animals on the earth all just disappeared, would there be no food anymore? That's a difficult question, right? If food is socially constructed in the way that we've been thinking about, does that mean that food is utterly subjective? And if so, would that even be a problem? Now, how we actually answer that question likely depends upon what we mean by subjective or maybe what we mean by less real. You might think, in some regard, something like a border or something like money would still exist even though all of the human beings stopped existing. Maybe we could say something similar about food. But what we say about that really depends upon how we're understanding this notion of subjective as it's related to objective. So let's compare those two ideas. We've got, on the one hand, objective facts about the world. These are facts about the world that are independent from anything that we happen to say. For instance, it's an objective fact that the Earth orbits the sun. Or we might say that it's an objective fact that the Holocaust once occurred, right? So even if human beings were to all disappear, still the Earth would orbit the sun. Even if tomorrow every single human being were to vanish from the face of the Earth, it would still be an objective fact that at one point in the past, the Holocaust did occur. These are facts that do not depend upon what we happen to think or believe about them. And that's different from subjective facts that seem to depend upon us, right? It's a subjective a fact about Christopher, about me, that I happen to be a big fan of Pearl Jam, right? I grew up in the 90s. I was kind of a grunge kid, and that's my favorite band. And that's subjective, right? That's just something about me that I would say is true from the inside. That doesn't mean that there's some objective thing out there in the world that we might call Christopher's Pearl Jam fanhood. No, that's just a subjective reality about me from the inside. Likewise, we might think of subjective facts as kind of preferences, right? It's a subjective fact or preference about Christopher, me, that I prefer chocolate over vanilla, right? There's no objective thing in the world that we're referring to. We're talking about the feeling that I have of liking chocolate more than I like vanilla. Right? So these facts depend upon me. They depend upon what I think, what I believe, what I experience from the inside. What we might say, it's like to be me, my own personal first person point of view, the subjective phenomenal experiences that I have as an individual experiencing the world. So how does all of this apply to something like food? Well, food is an interesting category. Food, you might say, is an object that can have both objective properties and subjective properties. In fact, lots of objects can have this, right? Take, for instance, a brown chair. The brown chair could have objective properties and subjective properties. Maybe some of the objective properties are things like its weight or its size, whereas the subjective properties would be things like its color, right? When I look at it, I subjectively experienced the color brown, but maybe somebody else, maybe you, or maybe another species like my dog, or maybe a Martian, some alien species, right? These other creatures, maybe when they look at the brown chair, they don't see brown. Instead, maybe they see purple or green. right? So something like color could be a subjective property of the chair. It's something in me. It's not really an objective thing out there in the world. Whereas something like size or weight would be an objective property of the chair, right? So this distinction has also been described by some philosophers following John Locke in terms of an object having primary properties or primary qualities and secondary properties or secondary qualities, right? So the objective primary properties would be things like mass, weight. The object has some determined amount of matter, for instance, or its size, its dimensions. We can measure its length, its width, its volume. But then also we could say that objects have subjective or secondary properties or qualities. These are properties that have the ability to cause experiences in us, subjective experiences. Like, for instance, the color. When I talked about the brownness of the chair, right? The object could look brown or look green or red, but the color, the redness, for instance, is not in the object itself. Rather, it's in us. It's in how our eyes are processing the light waves that we experience, right? So that secondary property is strictly speaking not out there in the world, it's subjectively in us. Or something like smell, right? The fragrance of an object is going to depend upon how our olfactory system responds to various molecules that are in the air. Or something like taste, right? The things like sweetness, tardiness, bitterness, these sorts of tastes arise not because those things are objectively out there in the world. They arise because of the interactions between our senses and the object's chemical compounds. An example I like to think about here with regard to smell or maybe taste would be something like trash, right? Think about how maybe you were in some garage and there was a bunch of trash that needed to be taken out. And even though somebody took the trash out, put it on the curb, still the garage kind of stank. It was sort of rank smelling. Well, that's because you are still experiencing the chemical compounds that are in the air, even though the trash itself has been removed. Or think about something like taste, right? It's likely, it's actually possible that you can taste something even though you are not experiencing anything in your mouth, right? We can actually trigger your brain to taste certain things, certain sweetnesses or bitterness, because we are tampering with the neurons firing in your brain in such a way that the same thing happens when chemicals are interacting with your tongue, right? So we can actually probe your brain in such a way that you experience the taste. And that suggests to us that taste is in us, it's not in the object. So let me now say a little bit more about taste and flavor. Taste is something that's often used. It's a term that we use to apply to our five basic senses. That this particular one corresponds to the tongue, right? Taste detects the following sorts of things: bitterness, sweetness, sourness, saltiness, and some people also include the sensation of savoriness, right? Following these sort of ideas, then flavor would include taste, but it also expands upon them. Flavor includes things like the sensation of smells or other aspects that we might attribute to food. For instance, we might say that the chicken wings are spicy, right? But the sensation of spicy is not really a taste. Rather, it's a tactile sensation that involves heat. When we're thinking of spiciness, we're thinking of something that involves feeling hot. So you might even say that the opposite of spicy would not be something like milk or water, but rather cold, the opposite of heat. When we're considering food in terms of its taste or its flavor, we need to understand how this can lead us to think of our body as detecting some object in the world, right? The way that we talk about it seems to imply that there are these actual properties out there in the world, and it's the interaction with those properties that we detect something that we would call its flavor or its taste. But there's reasons to think that's not the case. And the example that I want to offer here is an example that Placus gives us, it's based upon this person we're going to call Chloe. Suppose that Chloe is a brilliant scientist who has lived her entire life in a sterile laboratory. Not only has she lived her entire life in that laboratory, she's never eaten or tasted anything at all. Instead, let's say that Chloe has been fed various nutrients that she needs to stay alive, but all of that is unflavored and is administered through various feeding tubes. However, by stipulation, we're going to say that Chloe has studied the science of taste and flavor exhaustively, such that Chloe literally knows, she has knowledge of all of the physical facts, everything there could possibly be to know about taste and flavor. She knows all of the physical and chemical facts about our taste buds, about flavor compounds, about the neural pathways. She knows exactly what is happening in the brain when someone tastes chocolate or coffee or chilies or whatever it might be. All right, so that's Chloe. That's the place that we're beginning. Now, let's suppose that one day Chloe leaves the laboratory. And after she leaves the laboratory, she has a taste of strawberries for the very first time. The kind of strawberries that you might pick in June when strawberries are in season and really flavorful. Do you think that Chloe would learn something new in this particular case? By stipulation, she knows everything there is to know about taste. But is she experiencing something different when she takes a bite of the strawberry for the first time? Has she learned or experienced something new? Here's the argument that I want you to consider. First, before leaving the lab, Chloe knows all the physical facts about taste. Second, upon tasting the strawberries, she seems to learn something new. That is, what it's like to taste the sweetness of the strawberry flavor from the first person perspective, her own subjective experience of the flavor of the strawberry. Therefore, since she seems to know something new, and she, by stipulation, already had all the physical facts about taste, therefore, there must be more to the conscious experience and flavor that she has of the strawberries than merely the physical properties, merely the chemical compounds, right? More than what the physical science can capture and tell us about her experience of the taste. So I want you to think about this argument as it relates to the subjectivity of food. Does this argument tell us that food is actually subjective? Or does it only tell us that flavor is subjective? What do you think about the argument? Is it interesting to you? Does it shed any new light about taste and flavor, the subjective facts about this, and about the way we experience these? Or do you think that something like taste and flavor actually are objective, that they are literally in the food, or maybe they're identical to the chemicals that our taste buds interact with? These are the sorts of issues that I want you to think about as you're working on the assignments for this week and as you're considering what we mean by the metaphysics of food.